You ever meet someone who does the opposite of what they're asked all the time? Not to spite you or anything, they're just driven by some inescapable urge to walk straight past warning signs. You keep sitting them down and going, buddy, you're great, you really are. We all love you here. But exercise even the slightest iota of caution, please. Just a perpetual cycle of telling a child, hey, buddy, don't swallow quarters. And then the kid goes, well, why not? And then you start to say, well, I don't know, because I said so. But before you finish, they're already unhinging their jaw like a cash register and pouring loose change from your car's center console into it. Sure, their net worth may be raised a couple of cents, and one good fart gets them free parking. But if they don't cut it out, they're gonna suffocate. This is how the Emperor of Mankind felt about his 15th son. Welcome to the story of Magnus, kiddos. To understand Magnus, you need a better understanding of the warp. So here's the short notes. In Warhammer, the warp is a universe of unlimited power adjacent to the one we call our own. Some creatures are very much in tune with the warp and can access its mystical, incredible powers in our universe. Magnus was one of those individuals, and he was incredibly good at it. The warp is also home to all sorts of chaotic and evil entities like demons and 4 power-hungry gods wishing to breach into our reality. We'll only talk about one of those gods today in a few minutes. Also, when I say the word psyker, that refers to one of those warp-accessing individuals. It's pretty much a wizard in the simplest of terms. Okay, now we can get back to Magnus. The Emperor was an example of one of those psychers, and he wasn't just good, he was the best. The most powerful of powerful fellas had his 20 kids, called Trademarks, of which Magnus was number 15, chucked across the galaxy by those aforementioned chaos gods. As reality's worst dad scrambled to find where his kids went, Magnus was actually able to communicate with him through the warp the entire time. Growing up, Magnus actually had a pretty perfect world named Prospero. It was full of other psychers that had been ostracized by society, and as a result, they had made a paradise out of this planet. If you need a mental image, get concussed to the point where you believe that the aliens built the pyramids. That mental image is Prospero. This was an enlightened society, fully committed to discovering the knowledge of the universe, and Magnus was at the helm. This is where the first warnings about the dangers of the warp arose to him. Magnus's first mentor, Amon, told him to keep his ass out of the deep end, and he completely ignored it. This will be a common occurrence. It wouldn't take long for the Emperor to come pick up his son from daycare, and they hit things off pretty well. Magnus would spend several decades under his father's tutelage developing his warp-born powers, always warning him of the dangers in overindulgence. Unfortunately, Magnus wouldn't heed his father's insistence upon not conversing with the creatures in the warp. The sad part about this is, Magnus's first steps towards his downfall were entirely altruistic. Nearly every space marine born from the genetic material in Magnus would be sensitive to the warp. The issue being, a great deal of them were being transformed into mutants by its unpredictable power. The Emperor was considering culling the Legion as a whole and beginning anew, but Magnus implored him not to. Determined to find a cure for his sons, eventually he would end up turning to the warp, making a deal with a veiled chaos god named Tzeentch. His legion would be cured at the cost of his eye, but Tzeentch had sunken his hooks into Magnus. This cure would only be a temporary solution in order for Magnus to become more arrogant and reckless in handling the warp. This is the misfortune of Magnus, his paving of the road to hell with his good intentions. The extensive use of sorcery would have another unintended consequence, this being that other legions were still very hesitant to trust psychers at the time, let alone an entire legion of them. Nobody would take issue with them more than the Wolf King himself, Leman Russ of the 6th Legion. This was honestly unmerited from Russ, and completely unreasonable, but reasoning with him is often like trying to talk your way out of a firing squad. Here's the tough thing about Russ. He's often correct in his surmisations, but he's also a complete and utter hypocrite. The Wolf King actually had psychers in his legion that he would use in battle as well as space travel, but he refused to acknowledge them. As others would feel uneasy, Russ was downright disgusted and harbored a true disdain for Magnus. There was even an occasion where they almost squared up with each other in a brief interaction. My only question there is who in their right goddamn mind put these two in the same room together without adult supervision? The general mistrust of psychers through the various legions would lead to the Council of Nicaea being formed. All the brothers were gathered by the Emperor to discuss the use of psychers in the legions going forward. Here's the problem with the Council of Nicaea. Both sides of the argument were completely valid in their concerns, and not one should have trumped the other. In opposition to psychers, there was the obvious dangers of untamed warp energy corrupting the individuals that used it. In addition, a lot of the legions were victims of dangerous psychers in the past, and some horrifying shit was done to them. On the other hand, psychers were still incredibly valuable to the war effort. They also didn't choose to be that way, but still wanted to use their powers for the betterment of humanity. It was very much a double-edged sword that ended up falling upon the psychers. The consensus reached, to the chagrin of many Primarchs, was that the employment of psychers would be expressly forbidden. As much as this hurt every legion's power, it hurt Magnus the most. Obviously, Magnus would go on to break these rules, but to be honest, although not necessarily correct in doing it, it made sense. Sorcery was the basis of Magnus's entire legion. To have that suddenly prohibited was to remove their entire identity. Here is where things begin to completely fall apart for Magnus. Magnus's brother Horus gets stabbed with a shiv covered in shit and he dies of an infection. Then he is promoted to chief officer of those chaos gods we mentioned earlier. Magnus wants to warn the Emperor of this, so he uses magic to project his spirit into his dad's palace. Problem is, when he reaches the door through the webway, it's warded against magic so he can't get in. Specifics of the webway don't matter right now, just understand it's a bunch of wormholes interlinking the universe, kinda like a fast travel system. So, a mysterious being goes ahead and tells him that he can help open the door, to which Magnus, with no critical thinking, agrees immediately. This being is once again Tzeentch. So to summarize, Magnus has now used magic expressly forbidden by his father. He's kicked in his father's front door, and a shitload of demons have spilled through that door behind him. His intention was to help warn of the incoming threat, and he is now seen as a traitor. Upon his spirit's return to his body on Prospero, Tzeentch informed him that one day he's gonna make him Employee of the Month. Pissed at his son's astounding dipshittery, the Emperor gives Leman Russ a chance to drag his brother back home to face his father's divine belt. Here's where things get substantially worse, because initially that doesn't seem that bad. Horus talks to Russ before he gets to Prospero. Horus then tasks Russ with destroying Magnus's legion instead of simply escorting Magnus back home. Russ, not realizing Horus is corrupted by chaos, follows the order without question. Meanwhile, on Prospero, Magnus finally does some thinking and realizes he's been doing the bidding of a chaos god. Putting two and two together, he can see that this incoming clash was meant to destroy both legions involved. This is when Magnus' thinking coherent and not dumb as fuck thoughts stops. Magnus decides the best course of action now is to sacrifice the entire planet to minimize damage because, fuck, I don't know, you can't have anyone complaining if they're all dead. Not he's gonna try to talk to his brother, not he's gonna surrender to hopefully minimize casualty. No, he goes with, I'm gonna make my entire planet completely defenseless to the onslaught that's coming. He sent his fleets far away and he cast an illusion around the planet so that nobody could see incoming threats. Even saying it aloud annoys me, because who is this unfathomably stupid? As much as I wish that was rhetorical, the answer is Magnus. Magnus is this dumb. So, this perfect world starts getting completely razed because of his ineptitude. Libraries of infinite knowledge burned, observatories of the grandest scale decimated, all the while Magnus is skulking in his house. As he sat in his living room, he wasn't considering how this could have been prevented. He wasn't wondering, what's happening to my men, that I'm not out there to protect them. No, he was busy convincing himself that none of this could possibly be his fault. I would like to make this clear. Russ may have burned Prospero to the ground, but it was Magnus who made this happen with his deal with Tzeentch. Changing his mind about sitting on his ass while his entire planet got exterminated, Magnus finally got up to do something. Did he go to try to speak with his brothers? No. No, he used his psychic abilities to stop the Space Wolf attack, and then proceeded to get his spine broken over Lehman's knee when trying to fight him. In a fit of desperation, he begged Tzeentch for help, and he got his planet teleported into the warp, becoming a lapdog for the Chaos God. The only other event of note from Magnus during the Civil War was him being killed by Vulcan as a Primarch, and then his ascension to becoming a Demon Prince, once again getting killed by Vulcan. If that interests you, go check out the Vulcan video. Demon Prince Magnus does far more than he ever did as a loyal Primarch, almost entirely fueled by spite. Apparently, his necessity to blame literally everyone other than himself for his constant failures and idiocy is a fantastic motivator. Who knew? Magnus, wanting to exact vengeance upon Russ for destroying his home, something that once again was his own fault, attacked Lehman's home planet Fenris. In efforts to destroy the Space Wolf's ability to create new Marines, he would divide the 6th Legion's forces so that they couldn't mount a proper defense upon their homeworld. Then, like a child throwing a tantrum, he would stomp his feet and throw his toys, destroying the gene laboratories of an undefended Fenris until he lost a fight to a Space Marine. An achievement that would be the equivalent of a grizzly bear dying at the hands of a golden retriever. Leman Russ at this time is out wandering the warp, by the way. Magnus is a vindictive idiot, but he's not dumb enough to run that fade back. Then Magnus pretty much attempts to siege Fenris every 5 years constantly, because a life of failures like his doesn't matter when you have a god respawning you after every one of your fuck-ups. One of his escapades involved trying to steal an artifact known as the Spear of Russ. The initial attempt to capture the spear was a task failed successfully, which, according to Magnus, is the best he's ever done. Magnus would be walking through a portal onto Fenris, and got stabbed right in his working eye with said spear. He would then dislodge the spear sticking out of his head, using it in a ritual to transform all the 6th Legion's members into werewolves. Then, in the natural cycle of all things, Magnus fails again, as he always does. Swearing to destroy the Legion that, let's just recap real quick, he let destroy his planet after breaking a universal law because he thought he was too good for it. Then again, he attempts to siege Fenris, but this time he had been planning for a couple centuries. But we know how the story goes. Magnus fails and loses a 1v1 with another Space Marine. To be fair, this one is Logan Grimnar, who's an absolute force on a battlefield, but still, pretty embarrassing. However, his grand plan would result in the deaths of an entire planet's worth of people and the teleportation of Magnus's new wizard planet over what was left of Prospero. Then Rabute Gilliman kinda just stopped being dead. There's more to it, but all you need to know is he's the Primarch of the Ultramarines, he was dead, and now he's not. Gilly pretty much goes on the Space Odyssey, we'll cover that in his video, but the entire journey was set into action by Magnus. What Magnus desired was for Gilly to go through the very same rift in the webway that he had breached that time he attempted to do something intelligent before the Civil War. All of this in effort to strike at the Emperor's palace on Terra, also known as Earth, one more time. Gilly would sleuth out this plan, took a detour, landed on the moon. Magnus and his demonic army would follow, a massive battle occurring on the surface. Gilly and Magnus would face off, Gilly knowing that if he held out for long enough, help from Terra would soon arrive. Never having been the best at fighting amongst his brothers, Gilliman could stand his ground, but his feet were absolutely slipping against Magnus. Through an intervention of fate, cool bald ladies that can nullify warp powers showed up, and Gilly was able to beat his demonic brother back into the portal he came from, once again providing Magnus with the ever-familiar sensation of failure. This has been the story of the unfortunate series of events that Magnus the Red calls his existence. There's an alternate reality where Magnus actually stopped at stop signs and prevented the entire civil war that destroyed his father's empire. Not only that, there's one where he gets that unlimited access to knowledge he coveted so vehemently as a direct result of his father's favor. Sadly, we are in the reality where he's an arrogant, short-sighted prick who turned himself into a demon after sabotaging the hope for a stable reality. In terms of hypocrisy, there's only one other individual that tap dances on my nerves more than Magnus, and don't you worry that little peanut-shaped head of yours, I'll get to him eventually. Seriously, how do you take Leman Russ of all people? Leman goddamn Russ, a space Viking, and you make him look completely rational by comparison. What an incredible and completely avoidable fall from grace this was. If it makes you feel any better, we get to kill them in Space Marine too. Or maybe you feel differently. Feel free to express your opinions on the Radish Man in the comments. If you enjoyed this, feel free to take a look at our other Primarch videos. And by our, I mean me. I do this alone. If you'd like to vote on the final 4 in the future polls, hop in the Discord server in the channel info. Otherwise, thanks for watching, don't eat quarters, and have a good night.